It is 1913, at the height of the merciless Cat and Mouse Act. Inside a damp, cold cell in Holloway Prison, a woman lies captive, her body ravaged not by illness, but by calculated resistance. Her hands tremble, weakened by self-imposed starvation, yet the eyes that once set public squares ablaze remain unsubdued, sunken but defiant. The press reviles her. The government brands this frail figure a dangerous criminal. When she speaks, her voice is a hoarse whisper, drained of strength but sharp with one singular, unshakable demand. The vote, Emmeline Pankhurst. That name was once a target, hurled as an insult by politicians and the press. Today, it is honored in the very halls of power that once imprisoned her. This wasn't just a political victory. It was the brutal irony of a woman forced to live as an outlaw so that millions who came after her could finally live as citizens. Victorian England in 1858 was the workshop of the world, the heart of a global empire. It was a world of profound confidence, iron and steam, but it was also a world of rigid, suffocating rules. And for women, the rules were absolute. When a woman married, she ceased to exist under the law. She fell under the doctrine of coverture. She was covered by her husband's identity. Her property became his. Her earnings became his. Her children legally belonged to him. She could not sign a contract. She could not sue, and she most certainly could not vote. She was, in the eyes of the state, a passenger in her own life, the property first of her father and then of her husband. This was the world Emmeline Goulden was born into in Manchester. But crucially, she was not born into a family that accepted the rules. Manchester was a city of radical thought. It was the home of the anti-slavery movement, of free trade, and of fierce political debate. Her parents were abolitionists. They were reformers. Emmeline would later say that she was a suffragist on my cradle. There's a story she told about her childhood that reveals everything. While her brothers and sisters were read fairy tales at night, her father would have her read the newspaper to him. She was absorbing the language of politics, of parliament, of social injustice before she could fully understand it. She was bright, she was capable, she was educated, sent to Paris for finishing school. And it was there the central paradox of her life struck her. She was taught to be a perfect ornament for society, yet she was being raised in a family that questioned society's very foundations. The moment of her awakening was quiet, almost accidental. She was a teenager, and she went with her mother to a women's suffrage meeting. She left, as she later wrote, a conscious and confirmed suffragist. But in the 1870s, what did that mean? It meant joining the Manchester Society for Women's Suffrage, led by the formidable Lydia Becker. It meant a life of painstaking, respectable, and utterly frustrating work. It meant polite meetings in drafty halls. It meant writing letters to sympathetic editors. It meant meticulously collecting signatures for petitions that were dutifully presented to Parliament by sympathetic male MPs like John Stuart Mill. And once in Parliament, these petitions were a source of great sport. They were laughed at. They were ignored. They were filed away. The arguments against them were paternalistic and condescending. Women were too emotional to be trusted with the grave responsibility of a vote. Their delicate minds, MPs argued, were not built for the rough and tumble of politics. They were represented perfectly well by their husbands and fathers. To give women the vote, the argument would be to destroy the sanctity of the family, to pit wife against husband in a terrible political conflict at the breakfast table. The system was not designed to engage with this request. It was designed to absorb and deflect it. It was built on the unshakable assumption that women ultimately would do as they were told. Emmeline was not going to do as she was told. Her life was set on its permanent, unswerving course not by a political party, but by a person. In 1878, she was introduced by a family friend to Dr. Richard Pankhurst. He was, by every measure, everything a proper Victorian father would warn a daughter about. He was a barrister, a socialist, a radical atheist, and more than 20 years her senior. He was 44, she was just 20. He was known in Manchester as the Red Doctor, a man who passionately defended free speech, who supported Irish Home Rule, and who was a fierce advocate for public education. Crucially, he was the man who had drafted the very first women's suffrage bill to be presented to Parliament back in 1870. He had also been a key figure in drafting the Married Women's Property Acts, the bills that, for the first time, chipped away at the doctrine of coverture and allowed women to keep their own property and earnings. The connection between the young, idealistic Emmeline and the fiery established radical was immediate and electric. This was not a courtship of polite manners and societal approval. It was a meeting of minds, a recognition. In him, she saw a man who did not just tolerate her political passions, but who shared them, who had in fact been fighting for them since before she could vote, had she been a man. In her, he saw not just a beautiful young woman, but a brilliant, passionate, and unbending political soul. Her parents, for all their radicalism, disapproved. The age gap was too large. Dr. Pankhurst's finances were famously precarious. He was a man of ideas, not of business. But Emmeline was resolute. They married in 1879. This was not a Victorian marriage of property and subservience. It was a political alliance. Emmeline refused to be covered by her husband, even symbolically. She had made her name, Emmeline Goulden, known in suffrage circles, and she did not want to lose it. Richard, ever the radical, suggested they live together, unmarried, in protest of the laws of coverture. But Emmeline, pragmatic even then, knew that such a scandal would destroy their political effectiveness. They settled on a conventional marriage, but one lived on their own unconventional terms. They settled first in Manchester and later in London, and their home became a salon for the outcasts and freethinkers of the age. It was a whirlwind of socialists, radicals, atheists, and reformers. Keir Hardie, the founder of the Independent Labour Party, was a friend. Their home was a constant swirling debate about how to build a better world. And amidst this political whirlwind, they built a family. They had 5 children in 10 years, Christabel Harriet in 1880, Estelle Sylvia in 1882, Frank in 1884, who tragically died of diphtheria just 4 years later, a loss that hardened Emmeline and left a permanent scar, Adela Constantia in 1885, and finally a son, Harry, in 1889. By all accounts, Emmeline was a devoted and loving mother in these early years. She was not the distant Victorian matron. She filled their home with art, with ideas, and with a powerful sense of purpose. She rejected the dark, heavy, restrictive clothing of the era for her children, dressing them in more practical, artistic clothing. She did not just raise children, she was consciously raising the next generation of reformers. She read to them not just stories, but histories of struggle and revolution. But the political fight was always present, always the priority. She and Richard tried to work within the existing political structures. They were founding members of the Independent Labour Party, ILP, the new socialist movement that seemed to be the natural home for the cause of women's suffrage. They believed naively, as it turned out to be, that the socialists, so consumed with the rights of the oppressed working man, would surely see the justice in fighting for the rights of the oppressed working woman. They were profoundly wrong. This was Emmeline's first great political disillusionment. The male leadership of the ILP, while personally sympathetic, was politically hostile. They saw women's suffrage as a distraction from the real fight, which was for the working class. Their fear was tactical and deeply cynical. The only suffrage bill that had any chance of passing Parliament was one based on a property qualification, votes for women who owned property. The ILP leadership calculated that these women would be wealthy, educated, and overwhelmingly likely to vote conservative or liberal. Granting them the vote, they argued, would actually hurt the labor movement by adding thousands of anti-socialist voters to the rolls. They would only support women's suffrage if it was part of a bill for universal adult suffrage for all men and all women, something so radical at the time it had zero chance of passing. Emmeline was furious. She was learning a hard lesson, one that would define her entire life. No one gives you power. Your allies will trade your freedom for their own political advantage. You have to take it. The frustration was building, a low fire, year after year. She was raising her children, running a household, and all the while, she was petitioning, organizing meetings, speaking on street corners, and attending endless, fruitless committees. She and Richard had moved back to Manchester, trying to make ends meet, but their political work always came first, and their finances were a constant gnawing worry. Then in 1898, her world collapsed. Richard Pankhurst, her husband, her partner, her greatest champion, died suddenly from a perforated ulcer. Emmeline was 40 years old. She was a widow with 4 children. Frank was already gone, and she quickly discovered very little money. Richard had left their finances in a dire state. Grief could have broken her. It was the expected path. Society had a role for her now. The respectable Victorian widow, dressed in black, retiring from public life to quietly raise her children and live on the charity of friends. She could have faded into obscurity, a minor footnote in the history of a husband who had been more famous than her. But for Emmeline, grief was not an end. It was a clarifying fire. It burned away the last of her illusions. The man who had been her anchor, her partner in the fight, was gone. Now she was untethered. The polite, respectable phase of her life, the phase of being Mrs. Richard Pankhurst, was over. The fight was no longer something she did with her husband. It was his legacy, and it was her entire world. She moved the family to a small house in Manchester, and to support them, she relied on the paid job she had secured in 1894, registrar of births and marriages in a working-class district of the city. This job, which she continued after his death, was the final piece of her radicalization. This, right here, was the furnace where the polite suffragist was burned away and the suffragette was forged. Her office was a daily confrontation with the brutal, lived reality of what coverture and disenfranchisement meant for women who were not protected by wealth or a kind husband. She sat day after day and listened to the stories of the poor. She saw 13-year-old girls, their bodies still childish, coming in to register their illegitimate babies, terrified and alone. She saw wives bruised and beaten, whose husbands had drunk away their entire week's wages, leaving their children to starve. Because those wages were legally his, these women had no recourse. She saw women who had worked their fingers to the bone only to be thrown out of their homes by abusive husbands, with no legal right to their own children. And when these women, who had endured all of this, came to her office to sign the state's ledgers, she had to ask them for their names. Again and again they would look at her ashamed and whisper, "I can't." They would make an X on the paper. These were the women the politicians in London, in their comfortable firelit clubs, said were too foolish, too emotional, and too uneducated to be trusted with a vote. Emmeline Pankhurst had had enough. The years of polite letters were over. The decades of begging were done. The deference to the socialists, the liberals, the men who said wait, was finished. In 1903, in the parlor of her own home at 62 Nelson Street, she held a meeting. It wasn't a large meeting. It was just her daughters Christabel and Sylvia, now grown and steeped in the same radical politics, and a few other working-class women from the Independent Labor Party, women who were equally frustrated by the ILP's inaction. She was done with the old respectable suffrage societies, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, NUWSS, led by Millicent Fawcett. Fawcett and her suffragists still believed in persuasion, in petitions, in the slow, patient work of lobbying and education. Emmeline wanted something different. She wanted a new kind of army. She called her new group the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. Its purpose was not to ask for the vote, but to demand it. Its method would not be persuasion, but confrontation. Its motto was simple, and it would change the course of British history. Deeds, not words. This new army, born in a Manchester parlor, now needed its strategy. Deeds, not words, was a powerful slogan, but it was not yet a coherent plan of attack. The Women's Social and Political Union, born in the parlor of Emmeline Pankhurst's modest Manchester home, did not explode onto the national scene. For its first 2 years, it was a small, provincial, and largely overlooked organization. The deeds were still relatively tame. They were, in essence, a continuation of the work Emmeline had done with the Independent Labor Party ILP, but with a singular non-negotiable focus. They heckled politicians at rallies. They held their own meetings on street corners, forcing passers-by to listen. They were a nuisance, but not yet a threat. The key to the WSPU's future and its core tactical brain was Emmeline's eldest daughter, Christabel. If Emmeline was the movement's soaring emotional orator, its heart, Christabel was its cold, brilliant strategist, its mind. She had inherited her father's legal acumen, studying law at Manchester University, but was barred from practicing as a barrister simply because she was a woman. This personal, galling injustice fueled her radicalism. She, more than anyone, understood that the polite methods of the old suffragists were designed to fail. She was, as she put it, a rebel from my cradle. Alongside her was her sister Sylvia, the artist and dreamer of the family. Where Christabel was a political pragmatist, Sylvia was a passionate, uncompromising socialist. She saw the fight not just as a political one for a vote, but as an economic one for the total liberation of the working class, especially women. The third daughter, Adela, shared Sylvia's socialist leanings, and the young son, Harry, was swept up in the family's all-consuming mission. The WSPU was a family business, and their product was rebellion. The moment that changed everything, the deed that finally broke through the wall of public indifference, came on October 13, 1905. The Liberal Party, poised to win the next general election, was holding a massive rally at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. This was the heart of liberal progressive England. The star speakers were Sir Edward Grey and a rising political star, the young, ambitious Winston Churchill. Christabel Pankhurst, and a young working-class mill worker named Annie Kinney, whom Christabel had recently recruited, went to that meeting with a clear, calculated plan. This would not be a polite request. It would be a political detonation. They went with the specific intention of being arrested to create a public scandal. Annie Kinney was a crucial figure. She was not a lady from a radical intellectual family. She was a factory girl who had worked in the mills since she was 10 and whose finger had been ripped off by the machinery. She represented the very women Emmeline saw in her registrar's office, the women the politicians claimed were too foolish to vote. The alliance of Christabel, the educated lawyer, and Annie, the self-taught mill worker, was a living embodiment of the WSPU's new class-crossing militancy. They took their seats and waited patiently. They listened to the long speeches about free trade, about Irish home rule, about all the great reforms the liberal government would bring. Then at the end, when the floor was open to questions, they stood up and unfurled a small hand-painted cotton banner. Will the liberal government give votes to women? The hall, filled with thousands of men, erupted. It was not just a political question. It was a violation of sacred social decorum. A woman's voice, raised and insistent, in the middle of a male political forum. It was the equivalent of shouting in church. The men howled, stamped their feet, and shouted, "Be quiet," and "Shame." The stewards, all men, rushed to silence them. They grabbed the women, trying to tear the banner from their hands. A scuffle broke out. The women refused to be quiet, shouting their question over and over. In the chaos, as part of this premeditated strategy of confrontation, Christabel allegedly spat at a police officer who was trying to drag her from the hall. This was the detail that electrified the press. It was the most unladylike thing anyone could imagine. Spitting was the act of a drunkard, a prostitute. It was a gesture of profound physical contempt. They were dragged from the hall and immediately arrested. They were charged with obstruction and, in Christabel's case, assault on a police officer. They were held in a cold police cell and brought before a magistrate the next morning. And here Christabel and Annie executed the final step of their plan. The magistrate, clearly wanting the embarrassing affair to disappear, offered them a choice: pay a small fine or go to prison for 7 days. Paying the fine was the ladylike thing to do. It meant accepting a slap on the wrist, admitting guilt, and letting the story die. Prison was for criminals. It was a place of filth, degradation, and social ruin. They chose prison. When the news broke that 2 women, one a lady, a lawyer's daughter, the other a respectable mill worker, had been jailed for asking a simple political question, it was a national scandal. It was exactly what Christabel and Emmeline had wanted. They had found the government's weak spot. The establishment could handle polite requests. It could not handle public, theatrical, deliberate martyrdom. The image of the 2 women, one privileged, one poor, united in a prison cell, was a public relations explosion. Emmeline Pankhurst, now in her late 40s, stepped onto the national stage as its general. She had found her weapon. The WSPU, almost overnight, became a national name. Money and new recruits began to pour in. The polite suffragists of the NUWSS were horrified by these unwomanly tactics. But for a new, younger generation of women, it was a call to arms. The family, now fully committed, moved its headquarters from Manchester to the belly of the beast, London. The war had begun. Emmeline Pankhurst was not by nature a lawbreaker. She was a woman who, as her daughter Sylvia noted, adored pretty clothes and elegant furnishings. She believed in the ideals of the British Empire, but she believed in them so much that she was willing to destroy their public peace to make them just. Her public image was a strategic weapon. When she spoke, audiences did not see the hysterical shrew the newspapers described. They saw a small, frail, and devastatingly articulate widow, dressed in fashionable and elegant clothes, her voice trembling not with hysteria but with a controlled, righteous fury. She was a lady, and she was daring the government to treat her as anything but. In London, the movement gained its most important allies, Emmeline and Frederick Pethick Lawrence. They were a wealthy, well-connected socialist couple who were captivated by the WSPU's new energy. They provided the movement with a headquarters at Clement's Inn, a professional staff, and, most importantly, a steady stream of funding. Emmeline Pankhurst Lawrence, a brilliant organizer, became the WSPU's treasurer and strategist, and together with her husband, she founded the newspaper Votes for Women. They also created the WSPU's brand. They chose the official colors, purple for dignity, white for purity, and green for hope. Suddenly, the suffragettes were not just a mob. They were an army with a uniform, a newspaper, and a flag. The Deeds Not Words campaign escalated with frightening speed. The WSPU organized massive theatrical marches, women's parliaments that would be held at Caxton Hall, culminating in a delegation marching on the House of Commons, determined to force their way in and confront the Prime Minister, Herbert Henry Asquith. Asquith was the new immovable object against which Emmeline's unstoppable force would break. He was a brilliant classical scholar who was profoundly, fundamentally opposed to women's suffrage. He did not just think it was politically inconvenient. He believed on a deep, almost primal level that women were not suited for it. He would meet with delegations of polite suffragists, listen with weary condescension, and then do absolutely nothing. The WSPU's response was to make doing nothing impossible. And Emmeline the General was always at the front. In 1908, she was arrested for the first time after leading a raid on Parliament. She was charged with obstruction and sentenced to 6 weeks in Holloway Prison. It is hard to overstate how shocking this was to Edwardian society. These were not, as the newspapers tried to paint them, just hysterical working-class women, though they were the movement's backbone. These were educated women, wives of MPs, wealthy society figures like Lady Constance Lytton, artists and writers, marching side by side with factory girls and seamstresses. And the state, confused and enraged, treated them as common criminals. They were placed in the second division, a category for thieves and drunkards. This meant wearing coarse, degrading prison uniforms, eating foul food, gruel, stale bread, and spending 23 hours a day in solitary confinement in a cold, lice-infested cell. They were forbidden to speak. For the older, more ladylike suffragists, this was a terrifying prospect. But for Emmeline's new army, it became a badge of honor. They were not criminals. They were political prisoners. And when the government refused to grant them this status, they found a new weapon. It was discovered almost by accident in 1909 by a suffragette named Marion Wallace Dunlop. When she was jailed for stenciling a passage from the Bill of Rights on a wall in the House of Commons, she was furious at being treated as a common criminal. She announced that, as a political prisoner, she would not eat. She would go on hunger strike. The government was trapped. They couldn't let her die. A dead suffragette in a state prison, a martyr starved by the government, would be a public relations disaster of unimaginable proportions. After 91 hours of fasting, the panicked prison authorities, on order from the Home Office, released her. The tactics spread like wildfire. Every arrested suffragette, including Emmeline and her daughters, now went on hunger strike. At first, the government caved every time, releasing them when they became ill. The WSPU had paralyzed the system. The women would be arrested, go on hunger strike, be released, recover, and immediately go out and break another law. The de jure government was being mocked by the de facto army of women. The Home Secretary, Reginald McKenna, devised what he thought was a solution. It was a solution of breathtaking cruelty. It was, in effect, medical torture. It was called force feeding. When Emmeline Pankhurst refused food in Holloway Prison, she was no longer seen as a political protester. She was seen as a lunatic, a patient to be cured. She was seized by wardresses, held down by force. She was a small woman, but she fought. It took multiple guards, male and female, to pin her to a chair or strap her to a prison bed. A prison doctor would then force her mouth open. When she clamped her jaw shut in a desperate, instinctual attempt to protect herself, they used a steel gag, a brutal metal instrument, to pry her teeth apart. Then they would shove a thick rubber tube, 2 or 3 feet long, down her throat and into her stomach. The pain was agonizing. The women would choke, gag, and vomit as the tube was forced past their larynx. Sometimes it went into their lungs by mistake, causing a terrifying sensation of drowning. Once the tube was in, a liquid mixture of bread, milk, and brandy was poured down a funnel. The process was a violation. It was a cold, clinical, state-sanctioned rape. The women's gums would be torn, their teeth broken by the gag. Their throats were left raw and bleeding. The vomiting was often uncontrollable. Emmeline Pankhurst endured this torture over and over again. She described it herself, smuggling a secret letter out of prison. The tube is pushed down into the stomach. Sometimes it goes into the lungs. And the prisoner, her breath cut off, is choked. I know this feeling. The drums of the ears seem to be bursting, the veins in the head throbbing. It is a feeling of nightmare and suffocation. They knelt on my knees, my arms were held, and one doctor held my head. I was fed twice in this way. I've been in prison before, but I've never been so badly treated. This was the quiet, hidden pain beneath the righteous public anger. This was the reality of the fight. The public, when news of this leaked, was horrified. Even many who opposed the vote were sickened by the idea of educated ladies being subjected to such medical violation. The government, facing a backlash, tried another tactic. They were losing the propaganda war. In the midst of this escalating brutality, a glimmer of hope appeared in 1910. A cross-party group of MPs, tired of the violence, put forward a new bill. It was called the Conciliation Bill. It was a compromise. It would not grant universal suffrage, but it would give the vote to about 1 million women, specifically female householders, women who owned or rented property. It was not perfect, but it was a start. It was a breach in the dam. Emmeline and Christabel, in a show of good faith, agreed to a truce. All militant activity, all window breaking, all heckling, all protests would cease while the bill was debated. The WSPU held massive, peaceful, and joyful marches in support of the bill. For months there was peace. The bill passed its second reading with a large majority. It seemed victory was, at long last, at hand. But the bill was in the hands of one man, Prime Minister Asquith. He despised it. And on November 18, 1910, he announced that, due to lack of parliamentary time, the government would grant no more time for the bill. He was killing it. He had stalled, waited for the truce to hold, and then betrayed it. The women of the WWSPU were not just disappointed. They were incandescent with a rage that was almost chemical. They had been tricked. They had played by the rules, and the government had cheated. For Emmeline, this political betrayal was compounded by a fresh, devastating personal tragedy. Her son, Harry, had died of polio earlier that year. The loss of her second child, in the middle of this brutal public fight, only hardened her resolve. That same day, November 18, 1910, Emmeline Pankhurst led a delegation of 300 women from Caxton Hall to march on the House of Commons. It became known as Black Friday. The new Home Secretary was the same man they had heckled in Manchester 5 years earlier, Winston Churchill. Churchill, like Asquith, was furious at the WSPU for their embarrassing militancy. He was determined to stop them. But he, too, was wary of the bad press from mass arrests. The prisons were full, and the hunger-striking women were a political nightmare. So he gave the police a new chilling order: do not arrest the women. Arresting them created martyrs. Instead, rough them up, exhaust them, humiliate them, into submission. For 6 solid hours in the cold November rain of Parliament Square, the police did exactly that. They did not just push the women back, they subjected them to a campaign of systematic, targeted violence. The women were punched, their noses broken, they were kicked, their ribs cracked, they were thrown to the ground and stomped on. And, as hundreds of documented accounts from that day later attested, the violence was explicitly sexual. Men in the crowds, encouraged by the police's inaction, joined in. The women were groped, their breasts twisted and pinched so hard they were bruised for weeks. Their arms were held back by police officers, while thugs in the crowd lifted their skirts and sexually assaulted them. Emmeline was at the center of it, punched and battered. Her sister, Mary Clark, who was also at the protest, was arrested and would later die from her injuries, as would another suffragette, Henria Williams, who had been struck so hard over the heart that she died of a heart attack 2 days later. The psychic damage was profound. Another of Emmeline's great illusions was shattered that day. She had believed deep down that if they were brave enough, the English gentleman, for all his faults, would eventually recognize their courage and give in. Black Friday taught her that the gentleman was a myth. The state, when threatened, was not a chivalrous opponent. It was a brute. So Emmeline Pankhurst decided she would become a brute too. The truce was over. The gloves were off. The polite protests were finished. If the government would not listen to their words, if it would respond to their peaceful protests with state-sanctioned sexual violence, then they would speak the only language the government understood, the language of property. In 1912, Emmeline stood on a stage and gave the order. "The argument of the broken pane of glass," she announced, her voice cold and clear, "is the most valuable argument in modern politics." Days later, on March 1st, 1912, she walked down Oxford Street in London's fashionable West End, took a rock from her purse, and threw it through the window of the Prime Minister's residence, 10 Downing Street. It was the signal. All across London, in a perfectly coordinated, pre-planned attack, hundreds of women simultaneously produced hammers and rocks from their handbags and muffs. They began a systematic campaign of window smashing. They targeted government offices, banks, post offices, and the fashionable shops on Oxford Street and Regent Street. The sound of shattering glass became the new soundtrack of the suffrage movement. This was a profound and irreversible escalation. This was no longer protest. This was property damage. This was, in the eyes of a terrified government and a scandalized public, terrorism. Emmeline Pankhurst had declared war. That sound of shattering glass was a declaration of war, and it was a sound the British government could not ignore. The argument of the broken pane of glass had finally made the WSPU's demands impossible to file away or laugh at. It was a direct physical assault on the property and peace of the establishment, and that establishment, enraged and bewildered, responded in kind. Emmeline Pankhurst, the small, elegantly dressed widow who had thrown the first stone at 10 Downing Street, was arrested along with hundreds of her followers. She was sentenced to prison, and in prison, the suffragettes deployed their final, most terrible weapon, the hunger strike. The government, led by Home Secretary Reginald McKenna, had its brutal countermeasure ready, force feeding. But this tactic was becoming a public relations nightmare. The stories of ladies being held down, of steel gags and rubber tubes, were leaking to the press, horrifying a public that, while disapproving of militancy, was deeply squeamish about state-sanctioned medical torture. Worse, from the government's perspective, it wasn't working. The women would endure the torture, serve their time, be released, and immediately rejoin the fight. Their resolve hardened by their martyrdom. The system was being paralyzed. So in 1913, the government devised a new plan. It It was a piece of legislation so cynical, so cruel, that it became infamous. Officially, it was the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act. Everyone else called it by its real name, the Cat and Mouse Act. The new law was a game of sadistic, bureaucratic cruelty, and Emmeline Pankhurst was its primary target. The cat was the government. The mouse was the hunger-striking suffragette. Here is how it worked. When Emmeline was arrested and imprisoned, she would begin her hunger strike. The cat would then do nothing. It would not force-feed her. It would simply wait. It would wait as she starved day after day, growing weaker, her body consuming itself. The prison doctors would monitor her, and just as she reached the brink of death, just as her organs were beginning to fail, her heart fluttering dangerously, and she was too weak to even lift her head, she would be temporarily released on license. She would be carried a skeletal figure to a supporter's home, a mouse hole as they came to be known, to recover. But she was not free. The cat would remain outside. Police officers would stand guard 24 hours a day, watching the house. Inside, her friends and fellow suffragettes would nurse her, spoon-feeding her broth, trying to bring her back to life. And as soon as she had regained just enough strength to sit up in bed, as soon as her life was no longer in immediate danger, the cat would pounce. The police would storm the house, revoke the license, rearrest the mouse, and drag her, still frail and ill, back to Holloway Prison. The cycle would begin all over again. Starvation, torture by deprivation, release at the point of death, partial recovery, re-arrest. This was not a sentence. It was a rolling, indefinite campaign of physical and psychological destruction, designed specifically to break her body and her will. Emmeline Pankhurst became a ghost, a woman perpetually ill, perpetually on the run, her life a dizzying blur of prison cells and sick beds. In 1913 alone, she was arrested and released under the Act a dozen times. She would be released, half dead, and immediately be carried on a stretcher to a rally, where she would speak, her voice a hoarse whisper, to a horrified crowd, before being seized by the police once more. The government's brutality, however, did not have its intended effect. It did not create submission. It created a level of militancy that shocked the world. If the government was going to treat them with such savage cruelty, the WSPU, under the absent leadership of Emmeline in prison, and Christabel, who had fled to Paris to avoid arrest from where she directed strategy, would respond with fire. This period, from 1912 to 1914, became known as the Wild Period. The campaign of broken glass escalated into a full-scale campaign of arson and infrastructure sabotage. The WSPU went deeper underground. They operated in small, secret cells, unknown even to each other. They became, in effect, a clandestine terrorist organization. They poured acid and ink into public letterboxes, destroying thousands of letters. They cut telegraph and telephone wires, isolating entire towns. They dug up golf courses, a symbol of male leisure, carving votes for women into the turf. And then they turned to fire. They set fire to empty houses and country mansions, especially those belonging to prominent anti-suffrage politicians. They burned down the refreshment pavilion at Regent's Park. They set fire to churches, arguing that the Church of England was a pillar of the male establishment that offered women only subjugation. They attacked symbols of art and culture, slashing the famous Rokeby Venus painting in the National Gallery with a meat cleaver. They even planted a bomb, which failed to cause major damage, in Westminster Abbey by the coronation chair. This was war. And Emmeline, the frail hunted mouse, was its undisputed general. Her life became one of a fugitive. She had to adopt disguises. She was Mrs. Richards, Mrs. Ashworth. She was smuggled in and out of buildings in laundry carts. The WSPU, in a move of astonishing audacity, formed a 30-woman bodyguard unit. Led by a fearsome woman named Gertrude Harding, they were trained in jujitsu, the gentle art of self-defense. These Amazons, as the press dubbed them, would surround Emmeline whenever she made a public appearance. When the police moved in to arrest her, these women would engage them in hand-to-hand combat, creating a diversion, a royal guard fighting to give their queen time to escape. In 1913, during a brief respite from the cat and mouse cycle, her supporters smuggled her onto a ship bound for America. She was going to raise money for the war and, more importantly, to explain their actions to the world. Her body was frail, her health shattered by the repeated hunger strikes, but her voice was pure iron. When she landed in New York, the U.S. immigration authorities promptly detained her at Ellis Island. The British government had warned them. She was an undesirable alien, a convicted criminal. But the public outcry, fanned by American suffragists, was so great that the White House, acting through the Secretary of Labor, was pressured to order her release. She traveled to Hartford, Connecticut, and on November 13, 1913, she stood on a stage and delivered one of the greatest and most important speeches of her life. She was not there to plead. She was there to explain the logic of violence. "I am here as a soldier," she told the packed crowd, her voice ringing with authority. "I am not here as an advocate of women's suffrage. I am here as a person who, according to the law courts of my country, it has been decided is of no value to the community at all, and I am adjudged because of my life to be a dangerous person under sentence of penal servitude in a convict prison." 11. She laid out her case with cold, unassailable logic. They had tried politeness. They had tried petitions. They had been ignored, betrayed, and assaulted. "We are here," she thundered, "not because we are lawbreakers. We are here in our efforts to become lawmakers." She explained the window smashing, the arson, the militancy that so horrified the American press in terms the audience could not ignore. You have to make more noise than anybody else. You have to make yourself more obtrusive than anybody else. You have to fill all the papers more than anybody else. We were called militant, and we were quite willing to accept the name. We were determined to press this question upon the government. She used an analogy that was startling in its clarity. What, she asked, would the men in the audience do if they were fighting for their own political freedom? Suppose the men of Hartford had a grievance, and they laid that grievance before their legislature, and the legislature persistently ignored it. They would probably begin by breaking windows. She was admitting it. She was justifying it. They were not victims. They were fighters, and they would not stop. "I am here to say," she concluded, "that we shall send this government of ours to their political death. We are going to win." She returned to England a hero with thousands of dollars in funding, and she returned to her life as a mouse, immediately rearrested and sent back to prison, where the cycle of starvation and release began anew. The government was stuck. They could not kill her. They could not stop her, and they would not give in. The stalemate was absolute and violent. And then came the ultimate sacrifice. It was not by Emmeline, but for her, June 4th, 1913. It was the day of the Epsom Derby, the most famous and prestigious horse race in the world. It was a sacred day in the English social calendar. The king himself, George V, was there. Society was out in all its finery. A massive crowd of tens of thousands lined the track. As the horses rounded the final high-speed bend at Tattenham Corner, a woman in a WSPU sash, Emily Wilding Davison, ducked under the railing, and ran directly onto the track. She was not trying to cross it. Eyewitness accounts and later film analysis show her stopping, turning to face the oncoming horses, and raising her hands. She stepped directly into the path of Anmer, the king's horse, which was thundering toward her at over 30 miles per hour. The collision was horrific. The horse struck her with the force of a cannonball, her body thrown into the air like a rag doll. She was struck again by the horse's hooves as it somersaulted, throwing its jockey. She landed on her head and lay motionless on the turf, a small broken figure in a crumpled sash. The crowd gasped. The race continued, but all eyes were on the woman. She was alive but unconscious, her skull fractured. She was taken to a nearby hospital, but she never regained consciousness. She died 4 days later. Emily Wilding Davison became the movement's first and only true martyr. Her death was a profound shock to the nation. Was she a lunatic, a fanatic, or a hero? The WSPU and Emmeline Pankhurst ensured it was the latter. Emmeline, herself just released from prison under the Cat and Mouse Act, pale and weak, took charge. She organized the funeral. It was not a day of mourning. It was a masterpiece of political theater. On June 14, 1913, thousands of women dressed in white marched in a silent 5-mile procession through the streets of London. They were organized in ranks like a disciplined army. At its head, a lone woman on a white horse. Behind her, more women in white carrying a banner, "Give me liberty or give me death." And then, walking alone, pale and gaunt, but radiating an almost terrifying authority, came Emmeline Pankhurst. Behind her, thousands more followed, marching to the sound of a single muffled drum. They passed by crowds of tens of thousands who watched in a profound, awestruck silence. Emmeline had turned Emily Davison's solitary, desperate act into a collective public sacrament. She had shown the state what the movement was willing to endure. She had shown them that her followers were willing to die for this cause. What, her procession asked, was the government willing to do in response? By the summer of 1914, Britain was a nation at a breaking point. It was facing the prospect of civil war in Ireland, and at home it was under sustained siege by an army of women it could not control. The stalemate was absolute and violent. The government could not kill Emmeline Pankhurst. They could not stop her, and they would not give in. She was unquestionably winning. And then, in August 1914, the world ended. The intricate, delicate, and deadly gears of European alliances, sparked by the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo, clicked into place. The great powers of Europe mobilized, and Great Britain declared war on Germany. The fight for the vote, the hunger strikes, the arson, it all stopped instantly. From a prison cell, where she was once again enduring the cat and mouse cycle of starvation and recovery, Emmeline Pankhurst, the state's most notorious domestic enemy, sent a message. The Women's Social and Political Union would immediately cease all militant activity. All hostilities against the government were suspended. The government, in turn, seized the opportunity with breathtaking speed. In a matter of days, a full and unconditional amnesty was declared. All suffrage prisoners, including Emmeline, were to be released. The Cat and Mouse Act was suspended. The police who had hunted her through the streets of London now stood down. Emmeline Pankhurst, frail and ill, walked free. But she did not emerge as a victor who had forced a truce. She emerged as a new convert to a greater, more urgent cause. The woman who had been the state's greatest enemy now, in a pivot so sharp it gave the nation whiplash, became its most ferocious and unexpected ally. Emmeline Pankhurst, the radical, the lawbreaker, the terrorist, became an arch-patriot. This is the great, complex, and painful contradiction of her life. It is the moment that her singular righteous cause was fractured, and it is the moment that her family, the very core of her movement, the daughter she had raised to be her lieutenants, was irrevocably broken. The WSPU, which had been a disciplined, clandestine, and effective war machine built to fight the British government, was not disbanded. It was retasked. Emmeline and her favorite daughter, Christabel, who returned from her strategic exile in Paris, threw the entire WSPU apparatus into the war effort. The transformation was total. The WSPU, which had once battled police in Parliament Square, now became the government's most effective recruiting tool. Emmeline and Christabel held massive rallies, not for the vote, but for conscription. They toured the country, their soaring oratory, once used to condemn the government, now used to condemn the German peril. They demanded that all able-bodied men sign up to fight. They went further. They launched a campaign of public shaming. WSPU members, the same women who had endured prison and force-feeding, began handing out white feathers, the universal symbol of cowardice, to any young man they saw on the street who was not in uniform. It was a brutal, psychologically devastating tactic, a public branding of any man they deemed a shirker or slacker, regardless of his health, his beliefs, or his family's needs. The very name of their movement was changed to reflect the new mission. The WSPU newspaper, once called the Suffragette, was renamed Britannia. Its new motto, once deeds, not words, was now for king, for country, for freedom. To Emmeline, this was not a contradiction. To her, it was a question of priorities. She was, at her core, a British patriot, a believer in the empire. She saw the war as an existential struggle for civilization itself. If Britain, the flawed but ultimate home of democracy, were to be defeated by German barbarism, the vote would be meaningless. The fight for women's suffrage could wait. The fight for the nation's survival could not. To her, it was the same fight, just on a larger scale. But to others, this was a profound, almost unbelievable betrayal. The government she was now championing was the same government that had just weeks before been medically torturing her and her followers. The politicians she now shared recruitment platforms with were the same men, Asquith, Churchill, McKenna, who had jailed her, lied to her, and sanctioned the sexual assault of her followers on Black Friday. And the deepest, most painful cut of this betrayal came not from her enemies, but from within her own family. Emmeline Pankhurst, the general, had demanded total, unquestioning loyalty. She was an autocrat who led a political cult. But Emmeline Pankhurst, the mother, had raised daughters who were as strong-willed, as intelligent, and as uncompromising as she was. This was a reality her nature as a general could not handle. The family was not just a family, it was a political unit, and with this new total pivot, it shattered. The first crack had already appeared even before the war. It was Adela, the third daughter. Like her sister Sylvia, Adela was a committed socialist. She had long been uncomfortable with the WSPU's singular focus on the vote, believing the real fight was for economic equality for the working class. She was also a gifted speaker, but one whose socialist message was diverging from her mother's. She was, in Emmeline's eyes, disloyal. She was questioning the mission. Emmeline's solution in early 1914 was cold, swift, and absolute. She summoned Adela. She gave her £20, a one-way steamship ticket to Australia, and a letter of introduction to a suffragette contact there. She was banished. She was exiled to the other side of the world for the crime of ideological dissent. Adela, heartbroken and isolated, left England. She would never see her mother again. The banishment of Adela was a prelude. It proved Emmeline's capacity for absolute severance. But the most painful split, the one that defines the tragedy of the Pankhursts, was with Sylvia. Sylvia was the artist of the family, the idealist, the true socialist. Where Christabel was the pragmatic, legalistic strategist, Sylvia was the humanitarian. She had long felt a deep unease with the WSPU's autocratic structure and its detachment from the lives of the poor. While Christabel and Emmeline were smashing windows in the West End, Sylvia had moved to the East End of London, the city's poorest, most desperate slum. She lived among the poor. She worked with them, and she came to a realization that separated her from her mother forever. For the women of the East End, the vote was an abstract concept. They needed food. They needed health care for their children. They needed fair wages and decent housing. They needed an end to the exploitation that was killing them faster than any lack of a vote. Sylvia had founded her own organization, the East London Federation of Suffragettes, ELFS. It was everything the WSPU was not. It was democratic, with decisions made by committee, not by decree. It was socialist, fighting for economic change, not just political rights, and, most heretical of all, it included men. Sylvia believed the fight for liberation had to be waged by the entire working class together. To Emmeline, this was a catalog of betrayals. The WSPU was for women only, based on the hard-won lesson that men, even socialist men, would always betray the cause. The WSPU was autocratic, run by her and Christabel, because she believed a war could not be won by a debating society. And the WSPU was single issue, the vote, believing that all other freedoms would follow from political power. In 1914, just before the war, Emmeline summoned Sylvia to a meeting in Paris, where Christabel was in exile. The confrontation was brutal. It was not a motherly disagreement. It was a political purge. Emmeline demanded that Sylvia dissolve the ELFS and fall back in line with the WSPU. Sylvia refused. She could not abandon the poor of the East End. Emmeline, in her cold, clear general's voice, disowned her. "You have your own ideas," she told her daughter. "We have ours. We must part." She officially expelled the ELFS from the WSPU. "You are not to use the name Pankhurst for your organization," she commanded. "You are not to speak from WSPU platforms." The split was complete, but the Great War made it permanent and poisoned it with a new profound bitterness. While Emmeline and Christabel were becoming the voices of jingoistic patriotism, Sylvia became one of Britain's most prominent and passionate pacifists. As her mother and sister were handing out white feathers to cowards, Sylvia was on street corners in the East End, organizing anti-war protests. She saw the war as the ultimate capitalist slaughter, a tradesman's war, where the poor of Germany were being forced to murder the poor of Britain for the profit of the rich. While Britannia was screaming for conscription, Sylvia's newspaper, The Woman's Dreadnought, was documenting the suffering of the soldiers' families left behind, fighting for fair wages, for the women now working in munitions factories, and opening nonprofit restaurants and childcare centers to support the community. To Emmeline, this was the ultimate betrayal. It wasn't just a political disagreement. It was treason. In her eyes, her daughter was a traitor, siding with the pacifists and socialists who were weakening the nation's will to fight the German peril. The gulf between them became unbridgeable. When Sylvia later had a child out of wedlock, a final defiant act against the conventions her mother had in her later years come to embrace, Emmeline's rejection was absolute. She would write to friends, "I have no daughter, Sylvia." This is the central agonizing debate of Emmeline Pankhurst's life. Was the militancy necessary? Or did it, as many moderates argued, actually delay the vote by alienating the public? The moderate suffragists, led by Millicent Fawcett, had continued their polite work all along. They argued that their patient lobbying, combined with the essential work women did in the factories during the war, is what truly changed the minds of the politicians. The counter-argument, the one Emmeline's life stands for, is that 50 years of polite lobbying had achieved precisely nothing. The moderates were ignored. It was the deeds, not words, the broken windows, the hunger strikes, the sheer screaming noise of the WSPU that forced the issue onto the front page and made it the single most dominant, unavoidable political crisis in the country. Emmeline's militancy made the polite suffragists suddenly seem reasonable and respectable by comparison. She had dragged the center of the debate so far to the radical left that the government, in order to find a compromise, had to move. But the other controversy is more personal. Was she a liberator or was she an autocrat? The WSPU was not a democracy. It was, by Emmeline's own design, a benevolent dictatorship run by her and her chosen successor, Christabel. They demanded obedience. They ruthlessly expelled anyone who disagreed. This included their oldest, most loyal friends, Emmeline and Frederick Pethick Lawrence, who had funded the movement for years, given it its home, and created its newspaper. They were purged in 1912 simply for questioning the wisdom of the new arson campaign. And most painfully, she expelled her own daughters. Adela for disloyalty, Sylvia for treason. Was she a loving mother? Yes, by all accounts in the early years. She had raised brilliant, powerful, independent women. But when the choice came between her children and her mission, she chose the mission. Every single time. This was the quiet pain of her life. The public saw the defiant general. But behind the scenes was a woman who had systematically, deliberately, and painfully amputated parts of her own heart to keep the fight going. She had sacrificed her family on the altar of her cause, and as the Great War raged on, the mother who had fought to give all women a voice in the world had created a devastating, permanent silence within her own home. This new, bitter war within the Pankhurst family would never find an armistice. It would run in parallel with the Great War, a private tragedy hidden behind the public crusade. For 4 years, as Sylvia organized anti-war protests and supported the poor of the East End, Emmeline and Christabel toured the nation, their patriotism and jingoism becoming indivisible from their public identity. And then in 1918, the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent. When the war ended in 1918, the Britain that Emmeline Pankhurst had fought both against and for was gone forever. It was a nation bled white, haunted by the ghosts of nearly 1 million of its sons. The old Victorian and Edwardian certainties, the unshakable confidence in a divinely ordered, male-run world, had been shattered in the mud of the Somme and Passchendaele. The world Emmeline had been born into was gone, and the world she had helped create was about to be born. The government, now led by the far more pragmatic David Lloyd George, faced a new reality. They could no longer ignore the demands of women. The argument that women were too delicate, too emotional, or too unfit for the grubby business of politics was laughable. Women had for 4 years kept the nation running. They were the munitionettes, handling high-explosive shells in factories. Their skin turned yellow by the toxic TNT. They were the farmers of the Women's Land Army. They had been ambulance drivers, bus conductors, and police officers. They had nursed the shattered men who came back from the front. The nation's survival had depended on them. Furthermore, the government needed to reform the vote for men. As it stood, only men who met a property qualification could vote, which meant that hundreds of thousands of the very soldiers who had fought in the trenches had no voice in the country they had defended. A new franchise bill was an absolute necessity. The question was no longer if women would be included, but which women. The government and the male establishment was still terrified. They were terrified of a true female electorate. They were especially terrified of the young working-class munitionettes. These women were single, economically independent for the first time, and had been exposed to the socialist, anti-war ideas of radicals like Sylvia Pankhurst. A flapper vote of millions of young, unpredictable women was a political nightmare. So they devised a calculated, brilliant, and deeply cynical compromise. In 1918, Parliament passed the Representation of the People Act. It was not a total victory, but it was the breach in the dam. The vote was granted to all men over the age of 21 or 19 if they had served in the war. And for the first time, it was granted to women, but only some women. The act granted the vote only to women over the age of 30, who either owned property themselves, were married to men who owned property, or who were university graduates. The calculation was blatant. By setting the age at 30, they ensured that the female electorate would be older, more stable, and more likely to be married. By tying it to property, they ensured this new electorate would be wealthier, and they assumed more conservative. They had, in effect, enfranchised the ladies while deliberately locking out the young working-class factory girls, the very women who had built the shells. How did the great general, Emmeline Pankhurst, react to this partial class-based victory? She and Christabel accepted it. They declared it a magnificent triumph. They were pragmatists. They had, after all, supported the even more restrictive Conciliation Bill back in 1910. They saw this not as a betrayal, but as a foothold. The principle had been won, the argument was over, the door was open, and it could now be wedged further. Their jingoistic, patriotic support for the war had also aligned them with the establishment they were once sworn to destroy. They saw this compromise as their just reward. With this victory in hand, Emmeline Pankhurst officially disbanded the Women's Social and Political Union, the army she had led for 15 years. Her disowned daughter, Sylvia, was furious. She saw it as the ultimate betrayal, the final proof that her mother and sister had never truly cared for the working class. It was a class-based insult, a victory for the wealthy women of the West End that was built on the backs of the East End women she had lived and fought with, who were now left with nothing. For Millicent Fawcett, the leader of the non-militant suffragists who had patiently lobbied and supported the war effort, it was a profound, if incomplete, victory. She would live to see the final equal victory 10 years later. But for Emmeline, the war had changed her in other more profound ways. Her patriotism, her all-consuming fear of the German peril, had not evaporated with the armistice. It had simply morphed, finding a new and, to her, even more terrifying target: Bolshevism. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had terrified her. She, the ultimate radical who had used the tactics of disruption and terror, became a staunch, unbending conservative. She who had fought the system now feared, above all else, its total collapse. The rise of communism, the specter of the mob overthrowing the state, seemed to her a new form of barbarism, a new kind of chaos that threatened civilization itself. She had fought to join Parliament, not to burn it down. This new consuming fear had even led to one of the most bizarre episodes of her life. In 1917, during the war, she had been summoned by Prime Minister Lloyd George. The former terrorist, hunted by the police, was now summoned to meet the Prime Minister as an ally. The British government, desperate to keep Russia in the war after the First Revolution, decided to send her, Emmeline Pankhurst, to Petrograd as an agent of the state. Her mission was to convince the new provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, to stay in the war. She was to use her oratory to appeal to the Russian women, to urge them to form battalions and fight the Germans. It was a surreal, failed mission. Emmeline, the former lawbreaker, now an emissary of the king, toured Russia, preaching patriotism and warning against the German agents like Lenin, who were promoting peace. She met Kerensky. She gave speeches, but she was a relic of a different kind of revolution, and she was ignored. She fled Russia just before the Bolsheviks seized power, now more convinced than ever that Bolshevism was the single greatest threat to the world. This fear defined her post-war life. She was now 60 years old. The great fight of her life was, she felt, won. Her family was shattered. She was permanently estranged from Sylvia and from Adela, who in a final agonizing blow had become a committed communist in Australia. And even Christabel, her beloved favorite, her chosen successor, had largely abandoned her. In the 1920s, Christabel became a fervent devotee of the Second Adventist movement, dedicating her life to awaiting the Second Coming, and moved to America. The break was not as violently political as with her other daughters, but it was just as complete. Emmeline was adrift. In 1919, she moved to North America, primarily Canada. She worked as a lecturer. Her cause is now radically different. She was no longer a suffragette. She was an activist for social hygiene, a euphemism for fighting venereal disease, a promoter of moral purity for the empire, and above all, a professional anti-communist, warning any audience who would listen about the Red Peril. In a strange, sad attempt to rebuild the family she had lost, she adopted 4 children she called her war babies, though her relentless traveling meant she was rarely a conventional mother to them. In 1926, she returned to England. She returned to a country in the grip of the general strike, an event that, to her, was the ultimate confirmation of her fears. She saw the strike not as a desperate plea for fair wages by miners, but as a Bolshevik-inspired attempt to overthrow the state. The ultimate rebel had found her final cause, the establishment. She joined the Conservative Party. The shock was profound. The woman who had been dragged in chains from Parliament, who had been tortured by a government of liberals and conservatives, was now joining them. The party of the establishment she had spent her life fighting was now her political home. Was this the final betrayal, or was it the logical conclusion of her journey? Historians and her own family were bitterly divided. To Sylvia, it was tragic and despicable. It was proof that her mother was an autocrat at heart, a classist who had never truly cared for working women. Once she had a platform, she had pulled the ladder up behind her. But to Emmeline and to others, it was pragmatic. She hadn't changed. The tools had. For decades, the tool to be heard was the rock, the fire, the hunger strike. She had used them to force her way into the political system. Now, the system was open to her. The Conservative Party was the party in power. What better way to effect change, especially her new anti-communist, social purity causes, than from the inside? She was simply completing her journey at last, from lawbreaker to lawmaker. In 1927, she was chosen as the Conservative candidate for Parliament in the constituency of Whitechapel and St. George's. The irony was almost too perfect. She was running as a Tory in the heart of the East End, the very place her socialist, pacifist, disowned daughter Sylvia had lived, worked, and was revered as a local saint. It was the final political battle between mother and daughter for the soul of the very women they had both claimed to fight for. but the general's body was broken. The years of prison, the repeated agonizing hunger strikes, the torture of force feeding, the endless stress of the cat and mouse act, the relentless campaigning, it had all taken its toll. She was 69 years old, but her health was shattered. As she was preparing for her election campaign, the conservative government, led by Stanley Baldwin, was preparing to table a new bill. The partial victory of 1918 had always been seen as a temporary measure. Now, 10 years later, the government was ready to finish the job. It was called the Equal Franchise Act. It would, at long last, give the vote to all women over the age of 21 on the exact same terms as men. It was the end of the war. It was total, unconditional victory. The bill was making its way through Parliament. Its passage was certain. Emmeline Pankhurst's body finally gave out. She fell gravely ill. Her strength, which had seemed superhuman, was gone. She slipped into unconsciousness in a nursing home. She died on June 14, 1928. She was 69 years old. The ultimate family tragedy was complete. The mother who had sacrificed her family for the cause died, in the end, effectively alone, estranged from Adela in Australia, from Sylvia in England, and with Christabel far away in America, absent at her death. Just 18 days later, on July 2, 1928, the Equal Franchise Act received royal assent and became the law of the land. Her dream was realized. The war was won. But the general did not live to see the final day of peace. It's tempting to sanitize the story. It's tempting to remember the statues and the portraits and to forget the reality. The reality is that Emmeline Pankhurst was a difficult, complex, and often cruel woman. She was a fanatic. She was an autocrat who demanded absolute loyalty and destroyed those who defied her, including her own children. But she was perhaps the woman that moment in history required. For 50 years, polite women had asked, they had reasoned, they had begged, and they had been ignored. Emmeline Pankhurst understood in a way the moderates did not, that power is never given. It is only ever taken. She understood that the state does not respond to polite requests. It responds to pressure, it responds to noise, it responds to the shattering of windows and the disruption of its peace. Her legacy is not just the vote. Her legacy is in the very tactics of modern protest. When Gandhi adopted the hunger strike in India, he was using a weapon forged in Holloway Prison. When civil rights activists chained themselves to railings in America, they were borrowing from the WSPU playbook. Emmeline Pankhurst taught the 20th century how the powerless could fight the powerful. 2 years after her death, a statue of her was unveiled. It stands in Victoria Tower Gardens, right next to the Houses of Parliament, the very building she had been dragged from in chains. The ceremony was attended by the Prime Minister. The establishment she had fought, the men who had called her a terrorist, now gathered to call her a hero. Her old friend and fellow suffragette, Ethel Smith, conducted the orchestra. As the statue was unveiled, the orchestra played The March of the Women, the old WSPU battle hymn, and in the crowd, watching silently, was Sylvia, the daughter she had disowned, the daughter who had carried on the other part of the fight for the poor and the dispossessed. The story of Emmeline Pankhurst is not a simple story of right and wrong. It's a story about the cost of change. It asks us a question that is still to this day deeply uncomfortable. What is the right way to protest injustice? And what do you do when the right way doesn't work? Emmeline Pankhurst lived as a saboteur so that her granddaughters could live as citizens. She was the woman England tried to silence, and in the end, her voice became the law of the land.